My husband booked a Hawaii trip for his whole family, but forgot to include me. I found out about the Hawaii trip by accident when my 8-year-old daughter Mia came running into the kitchen asking if she could bring her new swimsuit to Hawaii next month. I had no idea what she was talking about until she showed me the group text on her iPad that my husband Steve had included her in about the family vacation he was planning. There were flight confirmations for Steve, both our kids, his parents, his sister Rachel and her husband, even his brother, who he hadn't talked to in 2 years. 7 tickets to Maui for 10 days. My name wasn't anywhere. When Steve got home, I asked about Hawaii and watched him turn white. He started stammering about how he thought he'd told me and it was just a miscommunication. Then he changed his story to say he was planning to tell me but wanted it to be a surprise. When I pointed out everyone else knew, he said he must have forgotten to add me when booking and he'd fix it right away. But when he called the airline, suddenly the flights were fully booked and he couldn't add another ticket. How convenient. His mom called the next day saying how sweet it was that I was letting Steve have special bonding time with the kids and his family. That's when I realized this was deliberate. Steve had told them I was choosing to stay home. Rachel texted asking if I was okay with her taking my spot in the family photos since I wouldn't be there. My husband had literally written me out of our family vacation. The truth came out when Mia mentioned that Daddy said Mommy needed a break from everyone and would enjoy the quiet house. Steve had been telling the kids for weeks that I was too tired for vacation and wanted them to have fun without me. He'd poisoned them against me before I even knew about the trip. When I confronted him again, he finally admitted he thought I'd been too negative lately, and the family deserved a fun trip without my mood bringing everyone down. My mood? I'd been working 60 hours a week at the insurance company while he'd been unemployed for 6 months playing video games. But sure, I was the problem. Fine. If Steve wanted a vacation without me, I'd make sure he got exactly that. First, I called my boss and put in for the same 10 days off. Told him I needed to handle some personal matters. Then I started planning my own trip. Not a vacation, though. Something much better. See, Steve seemed to forget that I handled all our finances since he couldn't even remember to pay his credit card on time. He also forgot that his parents' house, where they'd stay before flying out, was actually partially in my name since we'd co-signed to help them refinance. And he definitely forgot that I knew about his little gambling problem that he'd hidden from his family for years. The week before their trip, I started preparing. I canceled the hotel reservation in Maui and rebooked it for just 2 nights instead of 10. But I made sure the confirmation still showed 10 nights. I also called the car rental company and downsized their minivan to the smallest compact they had. 7 people's luggage in a Corolla would be interesting. Then I started the real fun. I withdrew our vacation savings, approximately $8,000, and put it in a separate account that only I could access. When Steve's card inevitably declined in Hawaii, he'd have to explain to his family why we suddenly had no money. But that wasn't enough. I wanted Steve to truly experience what it was like to be excluded. So I invited my sister Lisa to stay with me while everyone was gone. We planned our own staycation with spa days, wine tastings, and expensive dinners, all charged to the credit card Steve and I shared. Every charge would send him a notification while he was trying to enjoy his beach time. The day they left, I played the perfect wife. Helped pack, drove them to Steve's parents' house, kissed everyone goodbye. Steve actually looked relieved that I wasn't making a scene. His mom gave me a patronizing hug saying she hoped I'd enjoy my rest. 2 hours after their flight took off, I texted Steve a photo of me and Lisa at the 5-star steakhouse downtown with the caption, "Thanks for suggesting I take a break." Then I turned off my phone. According to Mia later, the Hawaii trip was a disaster from landing. The hotel check-in desk was chaos when they arrived. Steve stood there with his family crammed behind him, while the front desk clerk kept shaking her head and pointing at the computer screen. His voice came through my phone 3 hours after landing, shaky and stressed. The hotel only had them down for 2 nights, not 10, and every other place was completely booked because it was peak tourist season. I sat at the steakhouse with Lisa, my wine glass half empty, and listened to him explain the problem like I might somehow fix it. I told him that sounded really terrible, and I hoped he figured it out. Then I hung up and waved the waiter over to order the chocolate lava cake that cost $18. Lisa raised her eyebrows at me but didn't say anything. She just lifted her own wine glass and we clinked them together. The next morning we drove to the spa downtown, the fancy one I'd walked past 100 times but never went inside because it seemed too expensive. The receptionist handed us robes and slippers and showed us to the relaxation room where we waited for our appointments. I got the full package with a massage, facial, seaweed body wrap, and something called a hot stone treatment. Every service got charged to the credit card, and I knew Steve's phone would buzz with each notification. Lisa got the same treatments, and we spent 4 hours being pampered while soft music played and people brought us cucumber water and warm towels. I kept picturing Steve in Hawaii trying to explain to his parents why money was suddenly tight. The massage therapist worked on my shoulders, and I realized how tense I'd been carrying everything for months. When we finally left the spa, my skin felt soft and my muscles felt loose, and I'd spent more than our usual monthly grocery budget. I didn't feel guilty at all. Steve called again while Lisa and I were getting ready for dinner. His voice sounded different this time, higher and more frantic. His credit card got declined at a restaurant where they'd taken everyone for dinner. Theodore and Lillian had to cover the bill for all 7 people, and I could hear Lillian's sharp voice cutting through the background noise, demanding to know what was happening with our finances. Steve asked if something was wrong with the bank, if maybe there was fraud on our account. I let him talk himself in circles for a minute before I said the bank was fine and hung up. Lisa looked at me from across the hotel room where we were staying instead of at home because why not make it a real vacation? She asked if I was sure about all this. I told her Steve was sure about leaving me out of a family trip and lying to our kids about it. He called 10 more times over the next few hours. I ignored the first 9. On the 10th call, I finally answered and kept my voice calm and steady. I explained that I'd moved our vacation savings into a separate account since he'd planned a vacation without including me in it. Steve started yelling immediately, his words tumbling over each other about how I was ruining everything and being vindictive and punishing the kids for something he did. I waited until he stopped to breathe and then reminded him that he told everyone I was too negative and needed a break from them. He told his own children that their mother didn't want to be with them. His parents thought I was choosing to stay home. He'd written an entire story about me without bothering to check if any of it was true. The line went quiet for a second, and then Steve hung up on me. My phone rang again 20 minutes later with a video call from Mia. Her face filled the screen, red and blotchy from crying. She was squeezed into a corner of what looked like a tiny hotel room with people moving around behind her. Caden kept hitting her arm trying to get into the camera frame, and she pushed him away while crying harder. Everyone was crammed into one room because that was all the hotel had available, and nobody was having fun, and Daddy kept fighting with Grandma about money, and why wasn't I there to make everything better? My chest hurt listening to her voice crack on the last words, but I made myself remember that Steve told her I was too tired to come, that I wanted them to have fun without me. He'd planted those ideas in her head for weeks before they left. This whole mess was his creation, not mine. I told Mia I loved her and I'd talk to her tomorrow, then ended the call before I could change my mind about any of this. Lisa brought up the money situation over breakfast the next morning. We were sitting in a cafe eating overpriced pastries and fancy coffee drinks. She said maybe I'd made my point and should send enough money, so the kids could at least enjoy some of the vacation. I stabbed my fork into my croissant and told her I wasn't ready to let Steve off the hook. We went back and forth about it, her voice getting sharper each time she pointed out that Mia and Caden were suffering too. I reminded her she'd supported this plan when I first explained it. She said she supported making Steve face consequences, not making my kids miserable in Hawaii. The argument ended when I threw down money for the bill and walked out of the cafe. She followed me to the car, but we didn't talk much the rest of the day. Theodore called my phone that afternoon, and his voice had that cold, formal tone he used when he was disappointed in someone. He said Steve had explained the whole situation to him, how I was holding their vacation hostage over a simple misunderstanding. Theodore launched into a lecture about family unity and the importance of forgiveness, and how marriage required compromise from both people. He talked about how Steve was trying his best, and I needed to be more understanding of the pressure he was under. Not once did Theodore mention that his son deliberately excluded me and then lied about it to everyone. Not once did he acknowledge that Steve had poisoned my own children against me. I listened to the whole speech and then told Theodore I needed to go and hung up while he was still talking. I pulled up our credit card statement online and scrolled through the charges from Hawaii. The cramped hotel room cost more per night than the original booking, because it was last minute. Restaurant meals for 7 people kept appearing with Theodore's and Lillian's names on the charges since Steve's card wouldn't work. 3 separate attempts to upgrade the rental car from the compact to something bigger, all declined. I pictured them trying to fit 7 people and all their luggage into that tiny car, driving around Maui with everyone crammed together and miserable. Part of me felt satisfied seeing the proof of Steve's disaster. Another part of me felt sick knowing my kids were part of that disaster. My phone buzzed with a long text message from Janelle. She called me selfish and cruel for ruining everyone's vacation, especially the kids' first trip to Hawaii. According to her, Steve was just trying to give his family a nice experience, and I was punishing everyone because of my control issues and negative attitude. She wrote 3 paragraphs about how I was being unreasonable and vindictive, how I was damaging my relationship with my children, how I was showing my true colors to the whole family. She ended by saying they all felt sorry for Steve having to deal with me. I read the message twice, my hands shaking harder each time. Lisa found me in the bathroom 10 minutes later, sitting on the floor with tears running down my face. She didn't say anything at first, just sat down next to me and pulled me against her shoulder. I told her hearing about how miserable my kids were in Hawaii hurt worse than I'd expected. She rubbed my back and said, Steve definitely deserved consequences for what he did, but maybe I needed to think about what I actually wanted from this whole situation. Did I want Steve to suffer? Or did I want my marriage and family to survive this? Because right now, I was getting the first thing but destroying any chance at the second. I sat on the bathroom floor until my legs got numb and my back hurt from leaning against the cold tile. Lisa helped me stand up and we went back to the living room where she made me drink a glass of water and eat some crackers even though I said I wasn't hungry. She asked if I wanted to talk about what I was feeling, and I told her I didn't know what I was feeling anymore. Mad at Steve, guilty about the kids, confused about whether I'd gone too far, worried that I'd broken something in my family that couldn't be fixed. My phone buzzed on the coffee table around midnight. I picked it up and saw a voice message from Steve that was 7 minutes long. Lisa watched me stare at the notification for a full minute before she asked if I was going to listen to it. I pressed play and put it on speaker. Steve's voice came through rough and tired like he'd been crying for hours. He said he was recording this at 2 a.m. Hawaii time, and everyone else was finally asleep in their cramped hotel room. He started by saying he was wrong about everything, and he'd been lying to himself about why he excluded me from the trip. The unemployment thing had destroyed him more than he'd admitted to anyone, including himself. He felt worthless and small, and like he was failing as a husband and father every single day. Planning the Hawaii trip with his parents' money and credit card points had been his way of trying to feel important again, like he could still provide something big and special for his family. But instead of including me and being honest about his feelings, he'd convinced himself I was the problem, and the family would be better off without my negativity bringing everyone down. He admitted he'd poisoned the kids against me by telling them I didn't want to come because I was tired of them. He said hearing Mia cry about how cramped and miserable everyone was had made him realize what he'd done to our family. He'd excluded his wife, lied to his parents and siblings, manipulated his own children, and ruined what should have been an amazing vacation because he was too proud and ashamed to admit he was struggling. His voice broke completely when he said he understood if I couldn't forgive him, and he deserved whatever I decided to do next. The message ended with him saying he loved me, and he was so sorry for everything. I sat there staring at my phone after the message finished. Lisa asked what I was thinking, and I told her I had no idea if Steve meant any of that, or if he was just panicking because the vacation was a disaster and his family was seeing him fall apart. She said that was a fair question, and I needed to figure out what I actually wanted before I responded to him. We stayed up until 3 a.m. talking about my marriage. I told her about the last 6 months of Steve being unemployed, and how I'd worked 60-hour weeks while he played video games and barely looked for jobs. I talked about how resentful I'd gotten doing everything while he did nothing, how I'd stopped telling him about my day because he never seemed interested, how we'd stopped having real conversations about anything important. Lisa listened and asked if I'd ever told Steve I was at my breaking point before all this happened. I realized I hadn't, because I'd been too busy being angry and working all the time to actually sit down and have an honest conversation with him. She pointed out that Steve excluding me was terrible, but I'd also checked out of the marriage months before without telling him how serious things had gotten. We'd both failed each other in different ways, and now we had to decide if we wanted to fix it or let it end. I fell asleep on the couch around 4 a.m. and woke up at 9 to 17 missed calls from Hawaii. 3 were from Steve, 2 from Theodore, 1 from Lillian, and the rest were from numbers I didn't recognize that I assumed were other family members calling to yell at me. I ignored all of them and made coffee while Lisa took a shower. My phone rang again at 10, and this time it was Lillian calling. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Lillian's voice sounded completely different from the cold, formal tone she'd used when she called me about giving Steve bonding time. She sounded exhausted and sad and older somehow. She said she needed to talk to me about what was really happening with the Hawaii trip. I braced myself for another lecture, but instead she said she'd been watching Steve completely fall apart over the past 2 days. She'd seen him crying in the bathroom, snapping at the kids, unable to sleep or eat or enjoy anything about the vacation. Yesterday he'd finally broken down and told her and Theodore the truth about why I wasn't there. He'd admitted he deliberately excluded me and lied to everyone about me choosing to stay home because I was negative and tired. He'd confessed to telling the kids I didn't want to come because I didn't love them enough. He'd explained about losing his job and feeling worthless and trying to prove he could still provide something by planning this trip without me. Lillian said she felt terrible for believing Steve's story about me being negative and needing space. She'd called me to say how sweet it was that I was giving Steve bonding time, when really I'd been completely excluded and lied about to my own children. She apologized for not questioning Steve's version of events, and said she should have known something was wrong when he seemed so relieved I wasn't making a scene at the airport. She asked if there was any way to fix this mess, or if Steve had destroyed our marriage completely. I told her I didn't know yet, and I needed time to figure out what I wanted. She said she understood, and she hoped we could work things out, because she could see how much Steve loved me, even though he'd made terrible choices. We hung up, and I felt even more confused than before. An hour later, my phone buzzed with a video call request from Steve's phone. I answered it and saw Mia's face filling the screen instead of Steve's. She was sitting on a beach towel with her hair wet and sandy, and she looked so small and sad that my chest hurt. Caden appeared next to her, and they both looked at me with these guilty, worried faces. Mia asked if I was mad at them for going to Hawaii without me. I told her I could never be mad at her or Caden for anything Daddy planned. She started crying and said Daddy told them I didn't want to come because I didn't love them enough to take a vacation with them. She said she'd believed him because Daddy seemed so sure, and now she felt bad for not asking me if it was true. Caden said he'd been mad at me the whole plane ride for not wanting to spend time with them. Hearing my 8-year-old daughter say she thought I didn't love her enough to go on vacation broke something deep inside me. I realized Steve's betrayal went so much deeper than just excluding me from a trip. He'd actively poisoned my relationship with my own children by making them believe I'd chosen to abandon them. He'd planted doubts in their minds about whether their mother loved them. That felt worse than anything else he'd done. I told Mia and Caden that I loved them more than anything in the world, and I would always want to spend time with them no matter what anyone said. I explained that Daddy had made some bad choices about the vacation, but none of it was their fault, and they didn't do anything wrong. Mia asked why Daddy would lie about something like that, and I told her Daddy was going through some hard stuff and made mistakes, but we'd figure it out as a family. We talked for 20 more minutes about their trip and what they'd seen in Hawaii, and I tried to make them feel better about everything. After we hung up, I went to my bedroom and cried for an hour. Lisa knocked on my door around 1 in the afternoon and said she had to leave because she needed to get back to work in the morning. Before she left, she hugged me tight and said whatever I decided about my marriage, I needed to make sure Mia and Caden knew none of this was their fault. She was right, and I spent the rest of the day thinking about how to protect my kids from the damage Steve and I had done to our family. I thought about what kind of example I was setting for them by seeking revenge instead of trying to fix problems. I thought about what they'd learn about marriage and conflict from watching their parents destroy each other. I realized I'd been so focused on making Steve suffer that I hadn't thought about what my actions were teaching our children about how to handle hurt and anger. Around 6 that evening, I logged into our bank account and looked at the balance in the separate account where I'd moved our vacation savings. I thought about Steve and the kids stuck in that cramped hotel room with his parents and siblings all crammed together and miserable. I thought about Mia's face on the video call asking if I was mad at them. I thought about what Lisa had said about making sure my kids didn't remember their first Hawaii trip as the vacation where their parents' marriage exploded. I transferred $4,000 back into our shared account, enough to cover a decent hotel for the remaining 5 nights, and some activities for the kids, and decent meals for everyone. It wasn't about forgiving Steve or letting him off easy. It was about making sure my children had at least some good memories from this trip, instead of just remembering everyone being cramped and fighting and miserable. I kept the other $4,000 in my separate account, because I still didn't trust Steve completely, and I wanted to make sure I had money he couldn't access if things got worse. 20 minutes after I transferred the money, my phone rang with Steve's number. I answered and heard him sobbing so hard he could barely talk. He kept saying thank you over and over and asking if this meant I was willing to work things out. I cut him off and told him we needed to have some serious conversations when he got home. I said we needed marriage counseling and he needed to tell his entire family the complete truth about why I wasn't invited and what he'd told the kids about me. I said I needed to see real changes in how he handled our relationship and our finances and his job search. I told him I wasn't promising to forgive him or stay married to him, but I was willing to try counseling and see if we could fix what he'd broken. Steve agreed to everything immediately. He said he'd tell his family the whole truth today, and he'd find a counselor as soon as they got home, and he'd do whatever it took to prove he could change. I wondered if he actually meant it, or if he was just saying what I wanted to hear because he was desperate and embarrassed. I told him I'd talk to him when he got home and hung up before he could say anything else. 2 hours later, Steve texted me that he'd moved the family to a better hotel with actual rooms for everyone, and they were going to try to salvage the last few days of the trip. He sent photos of Mia and Caden finally smiling at the beach building sandcastles and playing in the waves. They looked happy and relaxed for the first time since they'd left, and I felt relieved that at least they'd have some good memories from Hawaii. My phone buzzed with a text from Janelle that was much shorter than her previous angry message. She said Steve had confessed everything to the whole family, and they were all shocked he'd lied so much about the situation. She apologized for calling me selfish and cruel without knowing the full story. The apology felt more like something she had to send, because Steve told her to, rather than something she actually meant, but I appreciated it anyway. I spent the next 4 days working normal hours for the first time in months. I left the office at 5 instead of 8 or 9, and I didn't check my email after dinner. I went to the gym and met a friend for coffee and cleaned out my closet, and did all the things I never had time for when I was working 60-hour weeks. I thought a lot about what I actually wanted from my life and my marriage. I realized I'd been so busy being the responsible one and resenting Steve's unemployment that I'd never told him how close I was to my breaking point before any of this happened. I'd let the resentment build up for months without having honest conversations about how overwhelmed and angry I felt. Steve excluding me was terrible and unforgivable in a lot of ways, but I'd also failed to communicate how serious our problems were before they exploded. We'd both made mistakes, and now we had to decide if we wanted to fix them or give up. The day Steve and the kids were supposed to come home, I cleaned the whole house and made their favorite dinner and tried to prepare myself for whatever happened next. I heard the car pull into the driveway at 6 and my stomach twisted into knots. The front door opened and Mia ran inside first. She dropped her backpack and ran straight to me crying and saying she was sorry for believing Daddy when he said I didn't want to come. I picked her up even though she was getting too big for me to carry easily and held her tight against my chest. I told her I would always want to be with her no matter what anyone said, and she didn't have anything to apologize for. Caden hugged my legs, and Steve stood in the doorway with all the luggage looking tired and scared and uncertain. The atmosphere felt awkward and tense, like we were all walking on broken glass, trying not to make things worse. I put the kids to bed early that night and came back downstairs to find Steve sitting at the kitchen table with his hands folded in front of him. He looked up when I walked in, and I could see he'd been crying. I sat down across from him and waited for him to start talking. He took a deep breath and told me he'd been struggling with depression ever since he lost his job 6 months ago. He said every morning he woke up feeling worthless because he couldn't provide for his family anymore. He explained that he'd been using credit card points he'd saved up for years, plus money his parents offered to contribute to plan the Hawaii trip, because he wanted to feel important again. He wanted to prove he could still do something big and meaningful for his family even though he wasn't working. I listened without interrupting while he talked about feeling like a failure every time I left for work, and he stayed home playing video games. He admitted the trip planning made him feel competent and necessary for the first time in months. Then he looked at me and said, excluding me was the worst thing he'd ever done to anyone. He said lying to the kids about why I wasn't coming was unforgivable, and he understood if I couldn't get past it. I told him I understood what it felt like to struggle and feel worthless, but that didn't excuse what he did to me. I said he excluded me from my own family and turned our children against me, and I didn't know if our marriage could survive that kind of betrayal. He nodded and said he'd do anything to fix this, but he knew it might be too late. We sat there in silence for a long time before I finally went upstairs to bed alone. The following week, we had our first marriage counseling appointment with a woman named Dr. Patterson who came highly recommended. I expected her to take my side immediately when I explained what Steve had done, but instead she asked us both hard questions about how we communicate and handle conflict. She pointed out that Steve's betrayal was massive and had caused real damage to our family, but my revenge had also hurt our kids. She said Mia and Caden spent days in Hawaii watching their parents' marriage fall apart in real time, and that wasn't fair to them. She asked me why I hadn't told Steve how overwhelmed and angry I was feeling before everything exploded. I admitted I'd been so focused on being the responsible one and keeping everything together that I never actually said how close I was to my breaking point. Dr. Patterson told Steve he needed to take responsibility for his depression and job loss instead of hiding from it through elaborate vacation planning. She told me I needed to communicate my needs clearly instead of letting resentment build up until I wanted revenge. By the end of the session, we were both exhausted and neither of us felt vindicated. Dr. Patterson scheduled us for weekly appointments and told us we had a lot of work to do if we wanted to save our marriage. 2 weeks later, Steve got a call from a company where he'd interviewed 4 months ago. They were offering him a position with good pay and benefits starting in 2 weeks. He hung up the phone and just stared at me like he couldn't believe it was real. I could see he was nervous about whether I'd believe he was actually changing or if I thought this was just another temporary fix. Honestly, I wasn't sure what I believed yet. The job offer was great news, but it didn't erase what happened in Hawaii or fix the broken trust between us. I told him I was glad he'd be working again and contributing financially, but we still had months of counseling ahead of us. He nodded and said he understood he had to prove himself over time, and not just with one job offer. I agreed to keep going to counseling and see if we could rebuild something real, instead of just going back to how things were before. He accepted the job that afternoon, and I felt a tiny bit of hope for the first time since I found out about the Hawaii trip. 3 months later, our life looked completely different. Steve was working full-time at his new job and actually seemed to enjoy it. He came home at reasonable hours and helped with dinner and homework without me having to ask. We were both in individual therapy plus our weekly couples counseling with Dr. Patterson. The biggest change was how we talked to each other now. We had hard conversations about money and responsibilities and feelings instead of letting things build up. We sat down with Mia and Caden and explained in ways they could understand that Mommy and Daddy had both made mistakes and hurt each other, but we were working to fix it. Mia asked if we were getting divorced, and I told her honestly that we were trying very hard not to. We started planning a real family vacation for next summer, where everyone were included from the start. Steve showed me the resort options and asked my opinion on everything. Things weren't perfect, and I was still hurt by what he'd done to me. Some days I looked at him and felt angry all over again about being excluded and lied about, but I could also see he was genuinely putting in the work to change. He went to therapy every week and took his antidepressants and showed up for our family in ways he hadn't before. Our marriage had survived, but it wasn't the same marriage anymore. It was built on honesty and accountability now instead of me just holding everything together while he coasted along. I didn't know if we'd make it long term, but for the first time in months,